here's
Okay.
energy for some questions.
Okay.
So, is it okay? I'm gonna,
Oh, no, no, no,
Anthony, just make sure you start. I have some. Go ahead.
yeah, may I ask, do the Muslims have a theory of justice? Because we throw this word around, and philosophers have debated this topic since Plato.
Yeah.
And so usually when I hear Muslims say it, it's usually in a very, what's the word, kind of tribal sense, like justice for us and people that look like us and speak like us or whatever, in terms of, as opposed to like a all-encompassing idea of what justice is. So in the past, do we have treaties on like what Muslims, how they define justice?
I mean, theories of justice in the Aristotelian sense, yes. The most developed, in my view, is the treatise of Qadi Abdul Jabbar. Do I still have his book over there? He has a multi-volume. Do you remember the name of his multi-volume work? Al-Mughni, that's right. Al-Mughni. It has not been, part of the reason that it has not been given attention by modern Muslims is because it's rather tough to read. It builds upon Aristotelian theory of justice. And even, as Rami knows because he wrote an article about this, even the guy who claimed to write a book on natural law in Islam wasn't able to read that text, so he skipped over it and used Rasa'il al-Khams by Qadi Abdul Jabbar, which don't do the job. Now, there is, Razi has what is often called a theological theory of ethics, which is also a very sophisticated view of justice. So you can read the Razi. Now, so yes, if we're talking about people like Qadi Abdul Jabbar, Razi, to a large extent Ibn Rushd, because Ibn Rushd in his more philosophical works, his theory of ethics informs the theory of justice very clearly and obviously. And again, it's very theologically based. But theories of justice encounter a huge skip and leap after Kant, and in the modern age they become re-articulated and re-argued in very different philosophical terms. And if that's what we're talking about, then the answer is no, because there hasn't been, I mean, there have been attempts by someone like Soroush from Iran. I don't know other than Soroush. I mean, I don't count Arkoun. I don't count that Moroccan fellow, what was his name? I can't his name. But he didn't produce what would rise to the level of a theory of justice. Modern Muslim intellectuals have been largely absent from discourses on justice and even discourses on ethics.
Yeah, the reason why I asked is because I had a conversation with a Jewish man who's older, a friend of mine. He asked me, who are the Muslim ethicists, modern, contemporary? I was like, I
mean, compared to the Jewish intellectuals and what they've built. I mean, and the irony is that they've built upon the work of Maimonides, although
he was
Maimonides, compared to his Muslim counterparts, is a doesn't even compare. So when you read, I mean, when I read Jewish, what they call Jewish ethics, it easily a Muslim could have produced any of these works, quite easily. But again, I mean, when young people come to me and they say, what is the value of Muslims going into academia? What is the value of Muslims going to scholarship? And I don't think they realize how the extent to which we lose our most probing intellects. You know, people will grow up as Muslim but have a rigorous intellect, and then when they find this vacuum, they feel lost, and eventually they drift away from the entire Islamic tradition. And I blame us, because if they would have found Muslim intellectuals that set an example of how you can negotiate the Islamic tradition into and engage modern theories of ethics and modern theories of virtue and modern theories of justice, I don't think we would lose these intellects. I think they would stay anchored. I mean, what do you, for 30 years now, I have been experiencing the same. Do you remember this kid Wahid who was at Princeton and went to study philosophy at Harvard? You know, I think the same old story. It starts, initially comes from an Islamic premise, starts searching for the Islamic equivalent. Eventually the challenge becomes too much to create the parallels himself, partly because he doesn't know the Islamic tradition well, so eventually drifts away altogether and we lose a major intellectual asset. If Allah gave me $10 million, I would spend it on manuscripts and searching for Muslim intellects and supporting them until they produce books. And you know, if someone like me can be solicited by Cambridge Press for publications, any Muslim intellectual and scholar can reach a point where places like Cambridge and Oxford come to them and say, please write something for us. I mean, there are people who are much smarter than I am, and they would be able to do it easily.
Yeah, you know, I went looking because most of the ethicists that I read are either Catholic or secular. And I mean, my Arabic's not good enough to read. Yeah,
I mean, because you're making up for the negligence of others as a Muslim intellectual. Because the ball was dropped since colonialism, basically. Then the burden is on you to sort of make up for lost time, and it's hard. I mean, I have to admit it's hard because even the technical language is not there. So I have to reinvent the language in order to make up for that lost time. And I decided to do it in the field of law. So I mean, the article that I just the article that I just read called it's actually what type of law is Islamic law. I start out with completely philosophical discussion about what law is, engaging theorists about law. They usually, you know, I don't create a ghetto for Muslims. And then from there I go to, well, what about the case of Islamic law? So, you know, I know that probably the article will be read by very few Muslims, but I don't care. I mean,
where is it going to be?
It's going to be published, inshallah, in a handbook called the Routledge Handbook of Islamic Law. I'm its editor. So it's a collection of articles. The first article is what type of law is Islamic. Do you have an article on that? No. Okay. Inshallah, I am editing the Cambridge Companion for Islamic Law.
Sharia.
We're gonna Cambridge Companion for Sharia. You're gonna write an article for that.
Homework.
Phil, I'm going to do
No pressure.
No.
No choice. This is where the payback starts, you know, I fed.
Where else do you write? What else do you write?
I'm still a student.
You're still a student, but you published in a magazine or something?
He's published several very good academic articles.
Maybe you can share with us once.
He's going to Princeton to study with Professor Abou El Fadl's mentor.
That's all.
Mm-hmm.
He just finished Stanford Law. He got his MA from Oxford. He used to be at UCLA. He used to be my student at UCLA, and he's published in the UCLA Journal on Islamic Law. You have an article also in Islamic Law and Society. 2 articles or 1? Not just one. That's a big. The article is a very big deal. I read it right. So I mean, it's like what I said in Orange County. We have a lot of. During the 30 years of my career, I've encountered so many promising Muslims, and the one thing they're missing is support. And if they had the support, I think they would have. I mean, some of them I've kept track with. We're still on, still contact after 30 years. But they are like pioneers in the desert. They are like as if they're paving the roads where the roads have completely disappeared under the sand. And their job is as hard as that, because they're really going back and reclaiming the desert. So I always told them, you have to have the attitude of a martyr. Expect suffering, expect hardship. And when you have ease, then be very grateful for it, but don't expect it. Because they are resisted by on every side. Muslims don't appreciate their value, so they don't get a lot of positive feedback from their own people, and non-Muslims often fight them because they don't want them to reclaim the terms of the Islamic discourse, and they compete with them to control the Islamic discourse so that it will remain a colonized epistemology and a system of knowledge. And like all colonial battles, they get brutal. When people colonize something, they fight tooth and nail to maintain their colony. And Islam is colonized.
Ideally, aside from the fact that you're jaded, what do you see the Usuli Institute offering scholars like that in the future over the next 10, 15 years? How do you see the Usuli
The
Institute
first thing the
specifically?
Usuli Institute offers is insight, because I don't know how many places that you can go to that will speak so bluntly and openly and frankly about this. I mean, Muslim academics, for the most part, are all, for the most part, meek and cowardly. I know a lot of Muslim academics, and they speak in correct political jargon. They will not come out and say Islamic studies is colonized, because there's a risk to it. If there is all types of awards that are given in the field, and all types of recognitions, and all types of invitations, and all types of honorariums, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get these things because you say Islamic studies is colonized. Immediately, that is going to take you off the list for all types of things. But if you have a martyr's attitude, then you don't care. You testify to the truth. And so the first thing the Usuli Institute does, it's a space where you get the blunt truth. The second thing is, my dream is that it becomes a space to support these, to recognize, to identify these promising intellects, and to embrace them and support them. I mean, inshallah, the Trump years will be over, and we will be able to, recognize a promising intellect, for instance, in Iran or in Egypt or in Pakistan, someone who will have no opportunities
Afghanistan.
where they are, or from the hood.
I'm from the hood, I like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like that.
And then you provide them with support and training and in network so that they can, my dream is to even be able to support things like postgraduate fellowships to provide support until our graduate students are able to find jobs. Because it's very important, when a young budding intellectual comes out, they want support to be able to publish enough to create a track record so they can get a job. Without that, and either they apply for grants and fellowships offered by non-Muslims. Muslim grants and fellowships are non-existent. Now, if you, early on in your career, the only fellowships and the only grants that are available are, there is no such thing as objective, non-partisan support. That's a myth. Princeton is not an objective institution. Harvard is not an objective institution. Its subjectivity is the nature of human consciousness.
Yeah.
And the sooner we recognize this, the better off we are. So, of course, everyone has a vested interest, has an interest of power investment in the type of discourse produced. And the Usuli Institute's interest, from my view, is the reclamation and the dignity of the Islamic civilization and the exploration of what it means for our continuing jarayan, to use a Quranic expression, our continuing state of existence and continuing dynamic of existence. But again, it's an impoverished dream. It's the dream of the poor man, poor human being. For poor woman, poor man, because it needs support.
Let's stop calling it a dream. But I have a question.
Go ahead.
If it's okay.
Yes, please.
It's interesting what you're saying of supporting the graduates or this or that, and like you said, my dream really, I think all what you're teaching us now, but at this different level, should be really taught to children. It's like it's not that it's too late. I'm very happy to be here and to be getting something, but I imagine if kids use like the Quran, for example, as we use a dictionary. Like they're so comfortable with it that they know how to flip the page and go to verse blah 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 and say something that they want to say in a loving way. Because we didn't learn to love the Quran. We are Muslims, we are very good Muslims, I love my religion and everything, but yes, I do have doubts. When you were talking about doubts, very often I have doubts, and I allow myself to have doubts, and or to take off your knowledge completely. I think it's a good thing to have the doubts and to
Doubts are what a constituent element of building knowledge, because without doubt,
That's how I feel.
it's like how muscles build. I from my superficial reading, and is that muscles built by
You gotta break them down.
Yeah,
Gotta break
they have
them
to
down.
rip to rebuild.
Yeah.
And I think it's the way you teach children. I mean, memorization of the Quran in our modern day is not. I mean, I prefer a methodology of living with the Quran taught to children than
Yes.
simple memorization.
Yes.
We live in again. I mean, a memorized Quran is like just an extra copy of the Quran. That's not going to add anything. But
Yeah.
and it's like as Quran itself says that اتخذوا القرآن مهجورا, that if the thing that I worry about the most among American Muslims and Muslims in the West generally is that if they do not have an intimate relationship with the Quran and they're not sure how the Quran informs their ethical struggles, I don't think they will. I think they eventually will vanish. I mean, eventually
Yes.
their identities will be completely diluted and
It's already happening.
all over. I mean,
Yes,
you
it's
meet,
already
not-
happened.
it's not-
because you do meet a lot of people that you can tell from their name that they tell you, oh yeah, my parents were Muslim or my grandparents were Muslim.
I think they were Muslim. I have in Algeria, I teach in the
Yeah.
Canadian consulate. The secretary is Algerian. And I said, so you're doing Ramadan? I was going to invite her for iftar or something. And I said, but then she mentioned names that are really Christians. And then I asked, but your parents are who? She said, my mom is French and my dad, I think he was Muslim.
Yeah, we've encountered.
I get this so
remember
often.
The woman in the,
I think he was Muslim,
I
you
think
know?
he was Muslim.
I mean, and she's elegant and everything. And when you were mentioning that student that you said he straight away he started studying philosophy, it's because there isn't much written about the philosophy of Islam, really. And we all want to get an approach, you know, in a philosophical way. Like he said, he's reading the Christian one or the Kabbalah and the Buddhism and all this. All of this I find in the Quran when I read it, but now, when I'm an adult. But I had no idea earlier that these things exist.
You know, I really, one of the things that I also, if the Quran consistently emphasizes that whenever the Quran talks about jihad, it always talks about infaq, spending your money. And I think there's nothing really that that people, to the extent and in proportion that they spend and they invest in a cause, is the degree to which they will attain success for that cause. And I mean, have you read the type of money spent, even just in it's not just the Islamophobia industry, but the type of money that is spent serving
Sex, whatever, or like
Islamophobia.
movies, Hollywood. But yeah, I agree. But like if you take the Jewish, and I'm not defending them, of course, by any means, except that I'm acknowledging that they are genius. Some of them are genius in music and philosophy and all that. The very, very poor one, they have their kids studying on a lamp, you know, on one lamp, but they're learning about literature, they're learning music, they're learning this, and they're
But
trying to invest
They
in
value
those
that
kids.
though. That's the
Yeah,
thing.
That's exactly what I want to
they
reach.
value.
That's exactly what I want to reach, you know, and if they don't value this since they were kids,
there are
how would they
systems-
value it adults?
There are
Until
very
Muslim
extensive
parents
systems.
stop, until the whole you gotta either be a doctor, engineer, or lawyer thing goes, like there's not gonna be any value in like.
I mean, that's
But
part
you
of the
cannot say
colonized
all.
mentality, by the way.
Yes, but we cannot say all. I mean, generalizing is very difficult. It
No,
becomes
no,
paralyzing.
we don't mean, we're talking about social trends. I mean, because it is right that most Muslim parents,
Need to take those classes.
They don't see any value.
They don't see, no, they don't. It's like, it's easier for them to run away from it and say, I'm a Muslim, I'm a born Muslim. Yes,
and we
pray
still,
and this and this, but then,
we still don't. We still very much the earmark. I mean, I think I've in some context I've talked about this before, that part of what happened to not just in all colonized society and the breaking down of colonized society is that when people are colonized, there is no longer control their law. They learn not to trust law, because law becomes thoroughly the function of the powerful. They no longer negotiate, and they no longer trust social systems of knowledge, because also again, they're not participants in the construction of social knowledge. They invest themselves in a mythology, and that is, if only we can catch up in scientific, technological know-how, can we free ourselves from the colonizers.
Prove ourselves.
So, in other words, physical sciences. And so that becomes, and that is exactly what transpired in Muslim societies, is that they became vested, they became distrustful of social sciences and became distrustful of legal sciences and historical sciences because the colonizer even controlled the historical narrative about Islam and what you're taught in elementary schools and in high schools about your own history. You had no role to play in that. And we became thoroughly invested in physical sciences that give them empirical success, concrete empirical success. The problem is that since, I don't know if we ever decolonized, but
No.
since at least official decolonization, right?
Partial, just a tiny one.
Our social norms have not changed, so we're still trapped into that mindset of prove to me, and part of this, by the way, is part of, and I've read quite a bit in sociological studies, most all of them were actually sociological, and about this idea of the prototype of the how do I put this? That the idea that you do social sciences or you do law as a hobby in your extra time, and that is also part of that mindset. Is that so you become a medical doctor, you gain prestige, respect as a medical doctor or as a engineer or whatever, and on the side you can do whatever as a hobby. We're still trapped in that.
Oh, yeah.
So recently someone came to me and said, I'm organizing something about religion, or they asked me on religion and reason. And I'm thinking to myself, religion and reason is such an advanced discourse. There is so much written about the role of religion and reason that if you really want to have a discourse that would be respected in the world of respectable people, in other words, that would actually be engaged, you're talking about a level that the average mosque activists have just no awareness of, because they've actually never read studies on the elaborate history of intellectual discourses about religion and reason. But again, it's this attitude of, well, I'll do this thing on the side, and I will defend Islam through, and there's lack of sophistication, lack of
Engagement.
that that is, as an immigrant community, for the most part, because the immigrants and natives are still a world apart, especially the black community, because the immigrant community seems to be unable to realize how critical the black community is to any form of Islam in this country. The immigrant community, either it will evolve or completely vanish. And right now it looks like it's going to completely vanish. And so when we talk about all these things, I was amazed in Orange County that when people think that they can protect their children, make sure that the children grow up as Muslim, without investing in what we're talking about. And I think it's a delusion. If they don't invest in what we're talking about, their children and their grandchildren will not grow up as Muslims.
Absolutely.
It's already happening. Let me add a couple of questions that came in on email. So I'll read the two. Following up on our discussion of duality in Surah Al-Rahman, to what degree does the search for beauty in Islam require an experience of pain? I found this lesson explicitly in other philosophies and religions. For example, the Buddhist notion that part of beauty of the lotus flower is that it has to push through muck and mud to blossom. And I'm curious if and how it is expressed in Islam. And then secondly, why are there no female prophets?
No female what?
Prophets. The first, there are so much about the importance of suffering for consciousness of beauty. In fact, I mean, it goes to the, and even that when you get to the point of true consciousness and true irfan, you get to the point where you don't associate suffering with God's anger, but you love the suffering as much as you love its opposite. Without the false consciousness of suffering and pain, because false consciousness meaning that the experience, without experiencing, there is no growth in beauty. Any beauty achieved without suffering is artificial and weak. And I mean, you want to call it growing pains. The first, any teacher worth their soul, the first thing they do with a student is put them through all types of tests and tribulations. A teacher that dishes out nothing but honey to their student is worthless. Find another teacher. And of course, the teacher that dishes out nothing but salt is worthless as well. But
Salty
a teacher that is that you grow through the agony of experience and self-consciousness and self-awareness, and lessons in how you negotiate your humility. Without humility, you don't go anywhere. So there is a great deal, and if you want, and in fact, a lot of it you can read, a lot of it translated in English, in translations of Sufi texts. Now, having said this, I'll say that one of the things that is very striking is that modern Ahl al-Hadith type schools of thought in Islam, sort of Salafi, I mean, I don't like the word Salafi, maybe Ahl al-Hadith Wahhabi like, which emphasizes memorization. Memorization does not involve the agony of analytics, because when you are required to learn analysis, you go through dynamics of failure. You can never produce a good analysis from the get-go. The first analysis you produce, the teacher must say, this is garbage. Go back and do it all over again. The memorization is very different, the Ahl al-Hadith methodology. And so there are the ups and downs of pain and relief. And I think that is one of the big failures of the epistemology of al-Hadith, especially in the modern age. Because it produces a false paradigm of being in the Muslim Brotherhood is being all flowers and perfumes, and And so it becomes very unreal, it becomes like living in a false world, in a false paradigm, and so it comes crashing down. That is also why I predicted in '98 that the eventually Wahhabis are going to drop the illusion of their claim of representing a Muslim ummah and all of that, because it's not sustainable. They do it with such a false artificiality. So the quick answer to it is that and absolutely so much is written in the Islamic tradition about beauty and knowledge through training and pain. The second thing about prophetesses or female prophets, that's a tough one. Shall we just come back to it, or shall we just go on?
But there's no female prophets in any religion.
Some of the pagan ones.
this-
had-
yeah.
The
had-
pagan maybe.
Pagans
What?
had- The
Pagan
pagan.
pagan
Pagan is not a
religions.
religion.
Pagan?
Like ancient Mesopotamia.
Actually, a lot of them were prophetesses. Like
Yeah.
Well,
ancient
I mean,
Greek.
But they're not-
this
There
is
were
the-
goddesses like,
The
not
thing is that
prophets.
in the Greek tradition, where there were
God
female,
of beauty.
Oracles.
yeah, I mean,
Oracle.
whether a prophet or an oracle or
Like she said,
all
it's
sorts of
goddess.
more
There were
than
goddesses.
No, but no, they were actually, they weren't.
It's-
So
They were
oracles,
goddesses, but they're also oracles.
oracles, like they speak directly to
Yeah.
gods and gods.
Yeah, like me.
they were interconnected with ideas of eroticism and sexuality, and I think considering the history of male patriarchy,
Yeah.
any woman sent in the role of a prophetess would have been impossible to negotiate, unless she played the role that these oracles played in Greek history, which of course would have been quite problematic. But I think the role of prophets, and this is, by the way, Rabah al-Adawiya, in some of her poetry says this, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
She's, you know, okay, well, what do prophets do? They receive revelation and transmit revelation. But what do the aqtab, which, by the way, there were a lot of women, female figures in Islamic history, the aqtab, and including Maryam would be considered a qutb.
What is aqtab?
A what we would in English would call saint, like a saint. What do? What they don't simply transmit revelation. They actually are mentors and teachers. And so but it's a unlike a prophetess that would have been easily attacked, probably sexually assaulted and killed, or being forced in some bizarre Greek-like role. The female qutb, which we have that permeates throughout Islamic history, is a teacher, is a mentor, and that role is critical. And now, what if patriarchy was defeated? Would God have sent a female prophet? I don't know, but in light of male patriarchy, I don't think it would have been possible to send a female prophet. I think in male prophets, because all revelation was negotiated within the realities of human psychology and human social institutions. As God says, when the Meccans tell the prophet, we want a prophet who's an angel, or someone who flies and doesn't walk the earth. And God responds to them and says, God has not sent a prophet but someone who eats food and shops in the marketplace. In other words, a concession to all human social institutions. So I can't imagine within the history of male patriarchy a female prophet, knowing that even after humanity reached the level of maturity that it did with the last prophet, Muhammad, that the role of female saints remained quite tough. But what is remarkable is how many of them achieved that role within the Islamic civilization. That's a far more interesting question. And if I, again, talking about decolonization, if you wanted to decolonize, colonialism told us women in Oriental societies had no role but to provide sexual favors. That's a discourse of colonialism. If you wanted to decolonize, go back and relearn the true role of gender in your history, because it is far more nuanced than that, and far more complicated than that, and far more rich than that. And until we reclaim that, in other words, I don't know if the person who asked this question is aware of these. What year I gave these halaqas about female Muslim jurists?
No, it was like
Early
19.
90s.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was before that.
I mean, and that was just one text. I just used, no, that's not true. I used like 3 or 4 texts and just coupled together from these 3 or 4 texts the names of just a few women. And I ended up giving this session that was 6 hours telling the stories of women jurists, women teachers throughout in Islamic history. Now, the colonial discourse, what continues to live, the Orientalist discourse, is that Islam produced no female scholars. They only produced muhaddisat. What they want to say is that whatever women played the role in Islam, they did nothing but transmit hadith. And that has become, by the way, mainstream scholarly discourse, to the point that if you go to Princeton and you go to Harvard and you talk about female scholars, immediately they're going to say, oh, no, but, Islam never produced anything other than female muhaddisat. How did that become the accepted scholarly discourse? Again, because we don't control our field. Because that's what Israeli scholars said, and that's what eventually became accepted as the standard, the mainstream discourse. I am branching out as usual, because how did we go from
No,
prophets to that?
Yeah,
Well,
no, that's so important.
The role of women.
Like the Maturidis did say, right?
I gave, in early 90s, I gave a 6-hour lecture about faqihat, not about muhaddisat. I mean, and by the way, muhaddisat in a historical context were still scholars, because they were not computers, they were not care, they were not just sitting there and saying an without anything else, right? But nevertheless, our colonized field tells us, because Milchard, for instance, his big criticism of Asma Saeed's book is that the role of women in the Islamic history was useless, was completely insignificant. He actually wrote that it's an invention to try to attribute to women any intellectual role in Islamic history.
His lecture is available online, you can hear it, it's amazing.
I was just like on the question of whether females can be prophets. Some theologians did debate whether it was the case that some females were prophets.
That is actually true, yeah.
It's just interesting as a historical.
I mean, actually, there is a debate about Maryam, whether Maryam was a prophet or not. But there's also, in the Quranic verse, anyway, where Allah tells the Prophet that there are prophets that we told you about, and prophets we didn't tell you about. In the tafsir, if you go back to Quranic commentaries on that verse, they'll go on to talk about whether there were among those that were not mentioned in the Quran were female prophets, and then the report. Now, we get into this discussion about what's reliable and not reliable, what not reliable. That aside, but you're absolutely right. I mean,
In which surah? Sorry?
I'm trying to remember but I can look
It's
it up
okay.
very easily. You can look it up if you look up the word نقص. There's معهم قصصنا وعليكم. And the verse is escaping me, but بعضهم قصصناهم عليك. Yeah, some of them we've told you about, but in commenting on this verse, you'll find these long discussions about whether. Have you read it elsewhere? Like a theological treatise?
I mean, nothing that, I just know like the
I-
Maturidis, I think, held that there are
No,
female prophets.
but there is also in the Sufi commentaries on the Quran, they have long discussions about whether prophetess exists. But again, I mean, what were their role?
Yeah. Because it comes down, because the Quran uses the word wahi with regards to Maryam, and I think also
Yeah.
the mother of Musa.
Mother of Musa and huh?
The Pharaoh's wife? They use it?
I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
Asiya is
She
not.
received
is
Still,
not-
Maryam is the only one mentioned in the Quran.
No,
right?
Maryam, was it, I know, I'm thinking of Zawjat Imran when they're,
Oh.
but I don't think, I don't remember reading anyone saying that she was a prophetess. I've read something, I've read I mean, on the commentaries where they talk about whether Musa, whether Maryam was and anyway, I mean, but you're right, because it's like, well, who's a prophet? Receiving revelation, and we know that several women received direct contact with the divine through Jibreel or an angel. So, I mean, but again, I question what was their historical role, because if they transmitted revelation, it would have been impossible. If they did what Musa did, or what Isa did, or what Muhammad did, you mean, if female, again, but some Sufis would say no, they were, and they were either killed or their revelation was private. In other words, they didn't transmit, they only communicated within a family. So,
Okay, but your
Yeah.
assumption is that every society is patriarchal. There are some matriarchal societies too.
Mongol.
And so it's
but quite, I mean, again, statistically, what do we talk about
Yeah.
within societies that are I mean, I don't even think the society of Saba, for instance, and Malikat Saba was matriarchal. It was, yes, they had a queen, but it was still patriarchal. So the matriarchal societies are examples that are sociologically quite small.
Yeah.
And usually they have a mythology that is not sustainable at a large scale. I mean, it's a mythology that was quite specific to a particular geographical, social structure. I don't want to let men off the hook, because,
Oh.
but by their nature, I mean, men tended to hoard power quite aggressively, and it has, I mean, when women have been able to put men within a controlled space in matriarchal societies, it was usually it was a very aggressive mythology that literally scared this man into place so that they don't transgress and try to take over. You know, like.
So I
So
think-
yeah, it's
I was gonna say, I think either way, it's a nuanced discussion. I think if more people were aware of, it definitely come back. Because I feel like that I don't want to like impose any sort of like presupposition about why this question was asked, but I feel like, particularly in today's climate, with certain breeds of like feminism, I'm not gonna like bash feminism or anything like that, but it's like that. I could see someone asking that question in that vein, and I think if people were aware that, like, I didn't even know that Maturidi theologians debated that, like, I feel like that nuance would definitely, like, alleviate some of those sort of.
I mean, this is the blessing of scholarship. I mean, I didn't know about the Maturidis either. I thought they were Sufi. The ones that I've read was within the Sufi nature, on commenting on the Quran. But any field, and one thing I'm sure, I mean, this is the way some students have asked me, you know, how did you manage to maintain your belief as you go through scholarship? Because when you specialize in this field, you go through a place like Princeton or a place like Yale, there are so many pressures on you that deconstruct your system of belief. It's amazing. I mean, only people who've lived through it can testify to it. And I'll tell you, I've always had a confidence that the Islamic civilization is rich enough to render whatever claim I heard that degraded the tradition to always, you know, be in a position of tawakkuf until I know more, be in a position of suspended belief until I know more. So I would hear, I mean, I remember there was there's Patricia Crone passed away now, but she was visiting Princeton, she's friends with Michael Cook, and she had a scholar from Israel, his name was, I think, Lecker.
Michael Lecker.
Michael Lecker, that's right. And so Lecker and Crone gave a lecture. I don't even remember what exactly it was on, but no, I remember. It was about the incident in where a group during the time of the Prophet built a mosque and then invited the Prophet to come pray in it, and then the mosque, the Prophet receives revelation that he shouldn't pray in it, and they tore down that building. Now, Crone and Lecker interpreted this historical event in a way that is, if you're a believing Muslim and you don't know anything else, and you don't know more about this incident, you haven't studied it, and you hear it from their interpretation, it's devastating to your faith. Because the way they interpreted it makes you lose. And actually, I remember, you mentioned Shahab. He was there at that lecture, and he was really shaken. Because we were talking about it afterwards. And I remember the time Shahab, you know, I haven't studied this incident. I don't know if the things they're quoting and citing, but I have a presumption of suspending judgment until I study it. And he was telling me, well, that's intellectual cowardice. You know, you just, you know that they're reliable, they're good scholars, they presented the material. And you know what, it took me about 3 years before I was able to study it. And No, they did not present they presented the material through the lens of their consciousness,
Yeah.
which was already had made it presumptions, moral presumption, as ethical presumptions about who the prophet is. And so there was a lot of contradictory evidence that they completely did not mention in their article and in their lecture. And that attitude of tawakkuf has preserved me through so many incidents but I can tell you, every time I've gone back and studied the issue, looked at all the sources, not a single time has this not held true. I found that the things that troubled me were because of the way it was presented, not because of the evidence. It means the evidence was contradictory and conflicting. And there was an interpretive choice made in presenting what was presented. Not that the evidence supported my narrative, but that the evidence did not necessarily support their narrative. And there's a very big difference, and a very important difference.
Can I ask the closing question? Because we've now passed the 8:35
Oh, well.
hour, and you can decide whether you want to answer this now
Do you
or
wanna-
not.
Do you wanna check if there's anyone else in the room who wants to ask?
Oh, anybody else want to ask?
I have a tiny one. I know I asked too many. But it's regarding the pain, you know. I was reading and watching things about Hallaj last night, and fantastic videotape and stuff, and they called him, because of his suffering and the way he was killed and all that, the Christ of Islam.
Well, Hallaj is the father of pain. But by the way, he went through much pain in his execution. I choose to believe this. Again, the evidence is conflicting. But when they were torturing him, he kept yelling out, "Ziduni, Ziduni."
Yeah, yeah.
He had reached a point where he saw pain as a great blessing, and he wanted more. And so he actually, I mean, of course, you know, people who don't like Hallaj say, oh, that he just yelled out Ziduni because he wanted to annoy his torturers. That he wanted to piss them off.
Well, at the beginning he didn't say Zatuni. At
Yeah,
the beginning he
yeah.
said it was not right, and then at the end
Then
he
he
ended
says
up with Zatuni.
But I think that's because of, I mean, I think that Allah's mercy came to him and made it all good, equal. But you know, I mean, just even reading Hallaj, by the way, I'm happy you brought him up because he talks a great deal about the role of pain in his evolution into consciousness. A great figure.
Yeah,
A great figure that Muslims have
I think so.
not studied. One of the people that I've grown recently very fond of, it was an Iraqi Sufi called Al-Mustaghnami, which is an unusual name. But I discovered his writings and poetry very recently, and he has remarkable tajalliyat that he describes in how he lost his children during his lifetime. He loved a wife very much and lost her to illness. He lost his mother and father in his lifetime. He was very close to his sister and she died. Grown very close to a friend who also died. And at first all this experience made him sour towards Allah very much. And then the same experience made him fall madly in love with Allah. And he documents that journey, that agonizing journey in his poetry. It's mind-blowing. It's just, that's the time when you read stuff like that, you realize you're nothing. I mean, Allah has given some human beings a blessing of such insights that, and then you also remember those people who say, why should we study our tradition, and you know, can't we just, and they're idiots. I mean, our tradition is full of such towering figures. It's amazing, amazing.
And what he says and how he describes God and all that, it's incredible. I mean, it's,
Okay, so last question.
Yeah, and if this is gonna take too long, we can maybe do it next time, but this came up last time, and along the lines of how you were able to suspend judgment and save your faith. You were gonna answer the question of how you were able to maintain your being openly practicing as a Muslim throughout your academic career.
Yeah, a lot of students have been asking this. I mean, I understand why. There's a lot of students who have gone into Islamic studies or history or sociology, or they're starting to experience the discrimination and there is, especially these days, it's the assumption that if you're a practicing Muslim, you're an idiot, or you're ignorant, or you can't be a good scholar, or you. Now, at UCLA, we even have worse, because apparently if you're a practicing Muslim, you get accused of being a ikhwan or
terrorist.
I mean, I'll be very honest and frank as always. I insisted on my legal right not to answer questions about my faith. And maybe because I became a lawyer first, I was rather obnoxious about this. And so when I was at Princeton, if any student asked me, "Are you a practicing Muslim?" I actually would respond, "That is none of your business." Now, not everyone can answer this way, but that's what I said. Because I was asked that question quite frequently by non-Muslim students. And I actually had to tell you exactly what I was used to say. As a matter of order, that is none of your business.
It's a matter of what? I'm sorry?
Order.
Order.
I say, excuse me, but as a matter of order, because the point here is the order of it, the meaning principle of it, that is none of your business. Now, having said that, and I was also at Princeton, when I was a graduate student, I was, I mean, my advisor knew who I was and what I was and exactly. But I was very quiet. I listened, I absorbed, I learned, I suspended judgment, but I resisted the temptation to get sucked into the system of positive reinforcements, and because I knew that if I did, I would either have to disclose or I would have to show what my beliefs are, or I would have to lie about them. So what I mean by this is that, for instance, Michael Cook used to have invite graduate students to his home for wine and cheese parties, and to rub elbows with other faculty from all over the university, including a world-famous mathematician, for instance, who was very socially awkward. Apparently he's won the Nobel or something like that. But in my days, Bernard Lewis would always be in these parties, and I would just, Avram Yudovich used to be in these parties. I would always be very measured. I know that, you go to these parties, you develop relationships with academics, and then you develop friendships and so on. I was very measured. I would go for a limited period of time, say hello, and leave. Now, eventually, as I got later on in my graduate student, there was a situation where, I wanted to speak about, I no longer wanted to maintain my silence, and especially that was after I finished my graduate studies, and now I became a teacher, and now I have to advise people, and then I knew that there is a cost attached to being open about who I am and what my beliefs are. But I decided to take the risk and to not complain about the price. Did it cost? Yes. My first job was not the job I wanted, and considering my accomplishments by the time I finished at Princeton, there were several jobs that I did not get because of that. I mean, one of them, I'll be very honest, was NYU. I made it to the short list. It became, and the person who got it, it was very clear that when it came down to the final choice, they picked the non-Muslim. And I heard from people in NYU why I was not picked. In my case, I decided I'm gonna suffer whatever it is, and I had the attitude of, I would spend hours doing dua, praying to Allah to give me patience, and you know this, give me the strength not to cave in, not to give up, to not make me homeless, to enable me to pay my bills. I threw myself at Allah's mercy. Now, having said this, this is not for everyone. So if you don't have the martyr attitude, then follow the methodology of silence. It's amazing if you just don't. People will often put you in a situation where there's an embarrassing silence, so you feel compelled to fill it with your noise. Resist that temptation and don't say anything. Let the awkward silence be filled by someone else. I have my own, I'll tell you another thing, and that again is what I believe. The reason I chose not to hide who I am until I got tenured was because I noticed that academics who tended to hide their identity until they got tenure, they seem to get into the habit of being compromised. And so time after time I would notice people's friends and colleagues and so on tell me, I'm just, not saying that I'm a practicing Muslim until I get tenure, but then they get tenure and they still continue doing what they're doing. I mean, because there's always some incentive, some promotion, some grant, some fellowship, some pressure by colleagues. But I've promised I would tell in my dua, I would tell Allah, if you put me through, I take a vow to help other Muslims. And in my relationship with Allah, I believe that's part of our bargain. I think your relationship with Allah can become individual and personal as long as you are willing to trust what Allah gives you as what is best for you and for your relationship with Allah. Not necessarily what you want, but what is best. Because it might not be what you want. You might end up being whatever Allah wants from you. But if you develop a relationship where you're satisfied and you are happy, because you know that is Allah's choice for you, because you have the type of relationship where you know that Allah has taken notice of you sufficiently that Allah Allah will choose for you, that's such a blessing. It's such a relief. Then you don't, then you're not being eaten up with dissatisfaction and anxiety and you know, whatever success I achieved is from Allah and came as a complete surprise. And I'm serious about that. Whatever success I had reached a point in my relationship with Allah with, I expected nothing. And whatever Allah gave me, I was extremely grateful for. Which also, you know, of course, like, I'm a human being, so, you know, I'll have times where I'll say, you know, I should be at Princeton. I should be at Harvard. I don't want to be in a public school, but then I roll myself back and I slap myself and slap some sense into it and say, no, be grateful to Allah, and this is your bargain with God, and this is what Allah wants from you, and say Alhamdulillah. And that's my answer. There's no magic formula.
It makes it a little easier to trust.
It makes it. I mean, it removes the burden off you because you know, in my first year in law school, because when I went to law school, there were no Arabs, no Muslims. I mean, in fact, back then, everyone would say, oh, you know, how could you become a lawyer in the Sharia of the Kuffar? You know, that was sort of the MSA ISNA type position. And my first year, I tried to join a study group. No freaking study group would take me because my last name was Abou El Fadl. And when the grades came out for the first semester, then, you know, I got invitations from all these study groups, but then I got slips when the grades came out, and I got these little slips in we had mail folders that were out in the open. Go back home, you dirty Arab, go back to your camel, you know, and then, you know, of course I took it to the vice dean back then. She didn't do anything because, as usual, you know.
This is in law school.
No, because when it happened, there was one time when someone put an anti-Semitic, someone put on the locker room, students' locker room, a swastika. There was a message from the dean, there was a message from the vice dean, and I went back to the vice dean and I said, you know, this is unfair. When it happened to me, you said, oh, let's not make it, but when someone put a swastika, it was, you know, and she didn't see it that way. So my point is that all of us have our personal stories of ups and downs, suffering and hardship. The fact that you see someone at their more advanced stage where they look like they're enjoying success, that just conceals. You don't know about how much suffering they went to get to that point. So don't despair. You know, if you persevere, Allah will help you. If you trust Allah, Allah will be with you. It's an old wisdom, about 1400, maybe even much older than that. Years old, but it's true. It's just the truth. The truth doesn't change.
Well, law school has not changed.
Law
Since
school,
you were a law student.
it's so sad because it was nasty.
We had almost an identical incident this year. And I mean, not all of the victims were Muslim, but it was.
I mean, it's just, and the more successful, the more brutal the incidents got. I mean, people can become very nasty, and
Let me tell this story too. When we came here for a visiting professorship at UCLA, you know, he was here for a year and people had to ultimately vote, but he went and literally had lunch with every single faculty member and put in the time to get to know them and explain what Islamic law was, why it's a legal system, why it deserves to have representation in the law school, which already had a Jewish law position. And people were, not, it's like, well, it's a dead legal system, why do we need to have an Islamic law professor, this is a luxury. And literally, like, put in the hard work to explain, and that was a really hard effort, but it was so important. It was not just for him, it was for the whole, he was the first person in a law school to be hired to teach Islamic law. And it was on his own effort. People think that, it's because someone bought a chair. No, it was really hard. And, so it's just, and
But it's so sweet now to remember.
well, yeah, it is, but
Bittersweet.
it's not over.
Bittersweet.
It's
Yeah,
not
it's
over.
not-
It's
it's not over.
a constant battle.
It's never over.
And it's just, he was a pioneer because he was the first, but there aren't that many more.
Yeah.
And now it's like, what is needed is people like Rami, who has a law degree, and now is gonna go study, Islamic law, and there's so few of those. There's maybe two, right? I mean,
True?
We have a lot to thank Professor Abou El Fadl for, because this struggle has made
made it easier.
it much easier for people.
And your path will make it easier for those that come
Sure,
after
well,
you.
there's struggle wagon was a lot to help others, and inshallah Allah will in turn help you. And whether even if not necessarily, even if you're in Islamic history or something, that's still it's just don't I think of people like who like when Khalid Blankenship at Temple, he became an inspiration for so many students. When Hamid Algar was at Berkeley, he was at someone like Mudarrisi at Princeton. Or Sashadina when he was at University of Virginia. I'm not sure if he's now retired. Probably is. Do you know? Sayyid Hussein Nasr. What school was he in?
Georgetown.
George Washington. Yeah. These are all pioneers, and they have. Someone like Ismail Farouqi at Temple. We all know, he ended very tragically, and it was part of the occupational hazard of his life because he and his wife were murdered. But this is just, these are shining examples. At the same time, there are so many examples that are an embarrassment, who sold their soul in order to get a job and get a position, and they're all over the place, and by the way, and they are the ones that, because when they meet a Muslim who remained true to who they are, it makes them feel guilty. These are the nastiest people towards Muslims, fellow Muslims. I get better treatment from a Jewish or Christian faculty than from a Muslim with a guilty conscience. Because they tend to be just very
Insecure.
yeah. It's like they go around carrying their shame on their shoulders, and they don't want to feel like that, so they fight you. They want to destroy you.
Whatever the reasoning is, I wanted to say that this also, like the story she told is very sweet. We moved here when I was 9. I'm almost 30 now. So between the ages of 9 and 29, for the last 20 years, he still does not have any relationship with any Islamic center in Los Angeles. And he's basically been here those 20 years, except for 1 year when he had a visiting professorship at Yale. And I can say, they can't say this, but I can say this, that these were the most underappreciated people, for people that, seriously, since I was 9, since before I was 9, since I was as early as I can remember, 5. But being in LA, this is what they've talked about over dinner, this is what they've talked about when I was at the arcade with my friends in high school, this is what they've talked about when I was running around, this is what they've been doing for the last 20 years. And as sweet of a story as what she just told is, it's tragic for me to see them so underappreciated within the Muslim communities here. to this day. I mean, that's why when my father gave the
we
lecture.
didn't know him.
Well, that's my
part of the-
point.
that's
That's
part of the
my point.
problem.
That's
That's-
the problem. The
that's-
last 20
that's-
years,
that's the
it's
whole
not
problem.
any time any Islamic center has asked him to speak, he goes and he speaks for free. So the point, you know, it's really
Do
it's
you know that
tragic.
the Islamic Center, every time people would ask about me, and this is, by the way, since '98, they would say, we invite him, but he's busy. And it's not true.
It's
a
a
shame.
They would always
What a
come and
shame.
they would say, why don't you come? And his answer would always be the same.
Wow.
Tell them to invite me and I will come. And then they go and they say, oh, we invite him all the time. He's always busy.
Which is not,
And it's-
there's not once that I was invited and I said no. Not once. In any of the Islamic centers in the area. And not once did I charge for any of the amount of time that I've been there.
Wow.
Even when I know that they've paid other speakers,
people, yeah.
I did it for free.
What a shame.
But
Yeah, they'll
it's
pay the non-Muslim speakers. They'll pay non-Muslim speakers. They don't pay the Muslim speakers, and it's not even that you've ever asked for payment. But the point is like I can imagine 100 years from now when they're looking at this historically and they realize how you've made it easier for future Muslim scholars teaching in American law schools or even just American universities in general. It's, you know, that Muslims right now have an opportunity to take advantage of this legacy, to actually participate in it and be a part of something historical. But I think, you know, for whatever reason,
Well, the attitude was always, well, your payment will come in heaven.
Yeah. Yeah, but like Grace said at the beginning, the Islamic Center was not really a place where you felt welcomed or you left the Islamic Center with a good feeling. So you didn't want to come back. So in spite of me volunteering there for many, many years at the beginning, you know, and having, you know, giving my soul really to everything, then I stayed away for the longest time because it was not bringing me anything. I had only two people I would listen to once in a while, Hassan Hathout and Fathi Osman, Allah yarham. You know, otherwise I never heard about Dr. Khalid. And the first time I met him, I said, where were you? I never heard of you. You know, and maybe it's my mistake too, of course. I'm not saying it's not.
But that's part of the, I mean,
It's horrible.
Because
It's not, because you don't control who comes to speak to the community. Other people do. And that's on them. They choose.
Yeah.
So, you know, and there's not really anything that anyone can do about
But
that.
it's the hierarchy
Well,
and the
I
name
mean,
and
people
who
can
are you.
demand, you know, people can go and
Of
demand,
course.
but if you're lied to, what are you gonna do?
it's in the responsibility of the people who run the Islamic centers, because I've noticed this when I worked in community outreach, that most Islamic centers create arenas for them to be heard, and they protect it and don't let anyone else in. I mean, this is what I wondered, like when I was working at MPAC, why people from the inner city, they had huge relationships like with Jihad Safir and Jihad Safir's father, why they had not been included at the board level, but we were including other. We don't honor other Muslims in other arenas,
Yeah.
and we still very tribal in mentality, and we hang on to this. If we need people in those influences within community where they have community influence to start putting the spotlight on people,
So,
you know, like my dad and other great American Muslim figures.
But it's
So I'll
the
tell-
support, again, it's the support, like really the heart of everything.
absolutely. I'll tell one last story, which I love. When he was a law student, he used to pray in the library, and people would be like, "Oh my God, what's wrong with him?" And so they would always interrupt him, and like, "Are you okay?" So
I
he,
did ruku on sujood too.
yeah. So he eventually put a sign on his back that said "Muslim in prayer."
Muslim and prayer, please don't interrupt.
Please don't.
Alright,
I think every time I do ruku, they think like I was having a stomach infection. This happened 3 times before I put up the sign. And then the sujood, there's a woman that came and said, "Oh my God, are you got your call the right place?" And then I had to come out of prayer. I said, no, okay, I'm doing prayer. I said, prayer? What prayer? This was, of course, this is early 80s. I mean, this is, before Islamophobia, before all of that stuff. So.
When people